I did have a PowerPoint, and I actually lost the memory stick last night and found it again this morning. But then we found that it couldn't work on this computer, so maybe it just wasn't meant to be. I'm not very good at speaking off the top of my head, so I'm going to read, and I'll decide as I go how much of the French to give you, because you won't be able to see it on the screen, and it might be a little bit disconcerting. So, the objective of my PhD project is to translate a selection of Algerian poet Mohamed Dib's Francophone prose and poetry. Mohamed Dib was born in Algeria in 1920, and his first language was Arabic. Although he's said to have attended Quranic school, he first learned to read and write in French. His writing reflects this early disjunction between the cognitive and affective self, which arises when one is schooled in a language alien, and in Dib's case, hostile, to the home environment. Everyone is exiled in some sense, and through his use of language, Dib displays a singular ability to stage and perhaps to exorcise this universal sense of alienation. There's no question regarding his command of the language. Of Dib's first volume of poetry, Ombre Gardienne, in 1961, the French surrealist Louis Aragon wrote, Je ne me trouve point devant une poésie traduite. Les mots sont les nôtres, les miens. In English, it would be, I do not find myself in front of a translated poetry. The words are ours, they are mine. And yet, Dib's poetry betrays the perennial ambivalence of a multicultural heritage, so that a sense of alterity, of a multiplicity of voices in the entities he portrays, permeates his writing. The polyvalence of his expression and the challenge of rendering this in the English language raise a number of questions. The first concerns the choice across some 50 years of output of extracts for translation. The second question concerns translation choices in the target language, the rendering of the sound, of the words, of the word order, of the register, of the tone. Underlying these issues is the challenge of rendering the ghost of Dib's native Arabic language and culture in translation. And a further question relates to presentation. How should the selection be assembled, annotated, reflected upon? What sort of virtual objects should the resulting translations present to the reader? For example, should I present entire collections or novels, or assemble a chronological or thematically arranged reader? Should it be bilingual? Could it take the form of a play or another medium? The practice of translating is both process and outcome, in the sense that it's only through the performance of translation that these questions can be addressed, while the approach that I take, once documented and formalized, will constitute a research outcome. Further, the performance of translation is analogous to the performance of a play in some respects. Anthony Ullman, in 2009, in a paper on Heinrich von Kleist and Samuel Beckett and Gilles Deleuze on performance, describes the frequently corrupted relationship between expression and affect, not effect, affect, that is introduced on stage by the Stanislavski School of Method Acting, when he says, and I quote, a familiar, easily recognizable emotion might be extracted and projected so that the audience do not sense the unfamiliar affect of the work, but rather recognize the familiar emotion offered by the actor. They are thereby comforted in the belief that they have grasped the meaning, and the play fails to affect them in the least. Just as in this kind of theater, according to Ullman, the actor's automatic emotion is in danger of interfering with the affect of the play, so the translator's stock phrase or conformance to a standard target language is an act of representation or standing for the source text, which interposes an interpretation of meaning drawn from the translator's preformed conception of a target culture. While introducing a shift towards the putative audience in the target language, the translator is in danger of fixing, in the sense of immobilizing, the text's generative capacity whereby all other possible affects are negated. In this paper, I'll provide a sample of verse and prose passages from Dieb's work and describe how following up different intertextual, historical, or biographical trails has assisted the translation process for different fragments of his work. Sources that have informed this research range from pre-Islamic odes and 12th century Attar Neshaburi's Conference of the Birds to the works of Gertrude Stein, Samuel Beckett, and Virginia Woolf. The rhizomatic nature of this process has informed a theoretical approach that draws on Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's discourse on literature in their book Mille Plateaux, 1,000 Plateaus, which licenses a conception of translation as a performative rather than representational act. I know from an interview with second-generation Algerian poet and ethnologist Habib Tengour, who knew him well, that Mohammed Dieb spoke good English, acted as interpreter for American allies in Algeria during the war, and is said to have been a great admirer of Virginia Woolf. He's also reported to have been extremely well-read and to have studied literature at the University of Alger. Thematic parallels can be drawn, for example, between the opening sequence of Virginia Woolf's The Waves, which some critics in France characterized as Virginia Woolf's phenomenology of light, and Dieb's first poetry collection, Ombre Gardienne, in a poem entitled Contre-jour, where the interplay of light, woman, and the ocean yield a comparable poetics. Also, structural parallels can be drawn between To the Lighthouse and Mohammed Dieb's 1962 novella Le Talisman. At this point, I would have a slide on which there is some text by Gertrude Stein from her long narrative poem, Winning His Way. I'm just going to read it out. Or her way. It is very often to have it warmer to content her. And they went their way. They were chosen to be one their way. This is the way that it was done. One. Then there's another passage. And then he knew that roses are red and are white and roses are rose-colored. The gaps in between the last passage are full stops. And you will have noted that in the first 5 lines, there isn't a single noun, there is no referent, it is just indeterminate pronouns. Her, it, her, they, their, this, that, and so on. In terms of form, Dieb's use of repetition, the indeterminate pronominal, and the full stop in his 1998 poetry collection L'Enfant Jazz suggests, if not an affinity with, then a dialogic relationship with Gertrude Stein's linguistic explorations and her predilection precisely for the same devices. Another intertextual trail would be Samuel Beckett's Worsted Ho, written in English in 1983, which Beckett considered to be untranslatable, although it was eventually translated by Edith Fournier in 1991 to great critical acclaim. I'll read a passage by Worsted Ho now. Whose words? Ask in vain, or not in vain, no knowing, no saying, no words for him whose words. Him? One. No words for one whose words. One? It. No words for it whose words. Better worse so. In translating Mohammed Dieb, I've come to realize that, like Beckett, Dieb writes for the voice, une écriture pour la voix. And though he only wrote 1 play for the stage, his 20 novels and 9 collections of poetry constitute a labyrinth of dialogic relationships where the polyphony of the self-reflective self in its description of experiential events or becomings constitute both theme and leitmotif. This realization, on my part, entails, for example, respecting Dieb's predilection for the indefinite and the infinitive, Both of these forms can sound inelegant in English, and both hold a privileged position in his poetry. Dib's use of tense and aspect, too, can shift without regard for continuity within a sentence, a stanza, or a paragraph. And a literal rendering of these discontinuities will create an awkwardness in the English translation, which, though tempting to rectify, I feel should not be altered for the sake of a misinformed sense of what sounds right in English, because to do so would be to alter key parameters of their form. I indicated in my introduction that Dib's native Arabic language and culture ghosted the French language in which he spoke to write. In this sense, Dib's writing is already a translation, in that he draws on Arab culture and mysticism, and his novels follow the Arab tradition of writing, a relation, or the rila, as described by Pierre Joris in 2009, in which plot is subordinated to errancy. This subordination in his prose gives the impression of discontinuity, both syntactically and textually, which is tenuously held together, more collage than development. While the interplay with the contemporary forms pioneered by Stein and Beckett is evident in both his poetry and his prose, I also propose in this paper to contextualize some elements of Dib's oeuvre with reference to Oriental schemas and examine how they serve to inform an approach to translating his works. And these are the Mu'allaqat and the Conference of the Birds. In doing so, I rely on translations from Persian and Arabic, together with translators' notes and comments, and show how some formal elements of Arabic literature are readily identifiable in Dib's work. According to Mary Catherine Bateson, who in 1970 undertook an extensive structural and linguistic analysis of the pre-Islamic odes known as the Mu'allaqat, the language of these odes is the homogenized Arabiya, also the language of the Quran, a more or less uniform dialect which evolved between the 3rd and 6th centuries AD. Algerian-born Jacques Berck, who published a French translation of 10 odes into French in 1979, described how these odes followed, and I'm quoting, an arcane formula, more or less constant from piece to piece, and it is upon this arcane formula, comparable to the traces of an abandoned encampment, or atlal, that these ancient songs at first invite us to dwell. And while there's a beginning, or nasib, there is no end to the tale. According to Bateson, 4 of the 5 Mu'allaqat she analyzed follow the same sequence of themes, beginning with the highly stylized nasib, with which the poet establishes his mastery of the form, followed usually by the journey or a travel theme by horse or camel, symbolic of the man's journey through life and also relatively stylized. And finally, the main body, which varies considerably from poet to poet and is considered to be the least rigid. At this point, I was going to show you a slide of a transcript of the poet Tarafa's Mu'allaqa, transliterated by Bateson. And it says, Kaula has, in brackets, Kaula, remnants in the gravel plain of Tamad, which show up like remains of tattooing on the back of the hand. Bateson's syntactic crib reveals that there was no finite verb in the original, which is a good illustration of the ode's characteristic analogy by juxtaposition. Instead of using English approximations, she hyphenates 2 words, gravel and plain, to indicate their etymological combination, thus providing the reader with an insight into their Arabic stems' original denotations. At this point, I would be showing another poem, the first one by Mohammed Dib, which illustrates his relationship to these poems. Opening an ode with an evocation of the atlal is fundamental to the schema of the Mu'allaqat, and a similar evocation recurs in the opening lines of 6 of the 9 poetry collections by Dib. In Dib's second poetry collection, entitled Formulaire, the opening poem refers to the word of the stone, which is an evocation, perhaps, of the second line of another Mu'allaqat poet, Labid, who is said to have lived in the times of the Prophet Muhammad, in which he said, writing entrusted to the hard stones. So I'll read the poem in French first, just the first few lines. It's called Exergue. Pour toutes les formes de sable, de vent et de vieillesse, je t'apporte mon visage, lunaire et très bas, marcheur avançant dans son ombre, fabuleux mot de la pierre. Dieu, comme si la nuit y avait oublié ses brèches. Epigraph. For all the shapes in the sand, in wind and old age, I bring you my face, lunar and very low. A walker advancing in his shadow, fabulous word of the stone, Lord, as though inside it the night had forgotten its cracks. In addition to thematic resemblance, some elements of form and syntax in the Mu'allaqat are notable in Dib's writing, though admittedly the extent to which this is due to the influence of the Arabic language or to these early poetic forms is probably impossible to disentangle. Enjambment, for example, is prohibited and very rare in the Mu'allaqat, and this makes every line capable of standing alone, rendering the line the basic unit of classical Arabic poetry. Accordingly, the integrity of the line has proved a guiding principle for me in translating Dib's poetry. Another example is the syntactic form of the simile in the Arabic language, which is principally the nominative sentence, often introduced by the comparative particle ka. Jacques Berck suggests this form of simile, often by juxtaposition of recurrent motifs, is the fundamental driver of the qasida. He said, c'est le poème dans son ensemble qui est un comme géant. It is the poem as a whole that constitutes one great as though. Berck gives an example in Un roi errant by Imru ul-Qais, which is another poet from those times, which in turn we can examine from Bateson's analysis. In her analysis, she wrote, as a translation, as though the peaks of the head of Al-Mujaymir at morning, because of the flood and the rack, were, in brackets, the whirl of a spindle. In her syntactic analysis, she listed a subject, a temporal phrase, a prepositional construction, and a complement, but no active verb to be. The particle ka is rendered by as though, and as can be seen from Bateson's tagmings, which I have just explained, the original Arabic line lacks the finite form of the verb to be. This passage offers a token of how the Arabic nominative sentence translates into English and French by adding the finite form of the verb to be between the subject and its predicate. However, Dib's poetry often employs ellipsis of the verb in what appears to be both a cultural and linguistic transfer from the Arabic. In light of this, I've found that the addition of the conjugated form of the verb to be, although canonical, is not always the most judicious translation. Instead, it's been useful to remember how Gertrude Stein and Samuel Beckett pushed the possibilities of the English language to the limit, and where possible, I've resisted the natural impulse to use plain English in translation and allowed mere juxtaposition to stand for predication. This form is more acceptable in verbal than written text and calls attention to its performative aspect, something to which I'll return when discussing intersemiotic translation as a means of enabling a fuller expression of Mohammed Dib's work in an English cultural context. Perhaps Dib's most overt allegory, based on a Sufi theme, lies in his version of The Conference of the Birds, entitled Simorg, which was published the year of his death in 2003. In the Quran, the bird symbolizes the resurrection, or rather the immortality of the soul. In Attar's tale, the 12th century Sufi mystic, a huge number of birds, led by the hoopoe, undertake a perilous journey across 7 valleys in search of the mystical divine entity, the Simorg. The text upon which Dib possibly based his own Simorg, originally translated from the Persian into French by Garcin de Tassy in 1963, is partly reproduced here. Actually, it isn't, so I'll just tell you a little bit about it. In Garcin de Tassy's version, which I'm not going to translate in full, 30 birds arrive at their destination. The Simorg, the mythical bird, then explains to them that the Son of His Majesty is a mirror. He comes here so that you can see himself in it, can see his soul and his body, can see himself in his entirety. Since 30 birds had arrived, they could see 30 birds in the mirror. But in Dib's irreverent version of the Conference of the Birds, only 12 birds arrive at their destination, as we discover in the following extract from the closing scene, which I will read in a minute. The second difference with Garcin de Tassy's version, and hence the original Attar Persian version, is the reflection in the mirror. So I'm now going to read a little bit of translation from Dib, but it's very short. One of us is missing at the roll call, doesn't appear in the reflection, and it's me. Fancy that. I can't see myself anywhere near my comrades, the other 11. But slowly, and this is me speaking, not Dib, but slowly a 12th figure does come into focus, and the narrator discovers, he says, "It was him, it is me, I am the Simorg." In Dib's tale, the search for the Simorg can be read on one level as an allegory for the writer, and his missing reflection in the mirror puts us in mind of Bakhtin's account of the individual's inability to see him or herself as a whole, which is something which only the outsideness of others can confer. This very brief summary doesn't do justice to Dib's full-scale rewrite of the tale of the Simorg. But the closing scene he depicts in minute detail brings to mind Samuel Beckett's short play Catastrophe, or Catastrophe, in which an old man simply stands motionless and mute, his face in the dark unto the last moment, while the director comments on his appearance, asking, "Why the gown?" In Dib's version, the shape of the Simorg comes together, and I quote, "little by little, imperceptibly, assuming a form, eventually taking body and texture, tunic upon tunic." In Catastrophe, the director suggests that one needs to déplumer quelques touffes, to pluck a few feathers from the standing figure. In Dib's version, the protagonist describes himself as, and I quote, "a miserable clown faffing about with his effing black feathered tuxedo from the second-hand rag merchant, all the while plucking off the last of his feathers." Quite apart from the thematic link between Beckett's Catastrophe and Dib's Simorg, there's something very post-dramatic, and I'm grateful for the definition yesterday of that term. There's something very post-dramatic about Simorg and much of Mohammed Dib's writing in the way he exposes his characters with the barest intercession between his pen and the reader. And the processing of translating his work draws the translator into the character's existential condition, whether author, narrator, or protagonist, so that the act of translation feels like a virtual enactment of the character's experience, much more so than a representation of this experience. And one way of externalizing this experiential effect is to take the translation one semiotic step further and to stage it. Staging this text in translation would allow multiple voices to be separated out, mid-sentence if necessary, without altering the form of the source text, and it would allow what may sound flat on the page in English to come to life when uttered out loud, or conveyed through gesture, dance, or other media. Dramatization arguably licenses a literal English translation where a written version may suggest that the source text was in poor style, or the translation poor, or both. In this sense, bringing the text forward to the reader consists not in adapting the text by domesticating it through syntactic or semantic adjustments, but rather in giving a new semiotic form to changes in perspective implicit in the source text. Different voices can be used to mark discontinuities in the source text, such as the Arabic nominative sentence or the disruptive interplay of anaphoric constructions, which indicate heightened alterity in the protagonist, or even to direct questions presented in indirect form, which, when answered, bring to mind a chorus. The challenge in staging Dieb's oeuvre is to locate the drama in the text and to identify the writer's implicit stage directions in order to provide the necessary condition for the generation of an isomorphic but not imitative expression, which in turn should allow the becoming of affects that are, as far as possible, unconstrained by fixity of interpretation by actor or translator. In this discussion, then, I haven't been concerned so much with representation of meaning, but I have been concerned with the generative elements of the form, which have also, insofar as it's possible, driven my translation. This ties in with philosophers Deleuze and Guattari. What interests them in a text is not what it means, but how its words, actions, spatial arrangements affect the reader in the intensity of becoming, le devenir. For Deleuze and Guattari, such becomings have nothing to do with imitation or even transmutation, but rather with a simple molecular exchange of particles. They say, no art is imitative, nor can it be imitative or figurative. Let us suppose a painter represents a bird. In effect, it is a becoming bird, which may only occur to the extent that the bird itself is becoming something else, pure line and pure color. I don't know if you noticed, but when I read the French poem by Dieb and then the English, they sounded completely different. They are completely different happenings or events. Finally, in terms of assembling elements of Dieb's work into a virtual object, I propose the analogy of the rhizome for piecing together an assemblage of translations of Dieb's work. The rhizome allows departures or breakages from the author's own assemblages through juxtaposition between disparate passages from his works across time within his own corpus, as well as with extrinsic visual, musical, or performance material. Dieb himself, in his book L'Arbre à dire, sees his œuvre as quelque chose d'ininterrompu avec des passerelles jetées d'un autre de mes livres, something uninterrupted, with jetties thrown down from one book to the next. Every passage forms a starting point, au milieu, in the center of his mythology, from which new lines can be perpetually formed until they undergo a metamorphosis. And so, acknowledging the indivisibility of Dieb's oeuvre as a whole, this project aims to grow nodes, throw shoots between pieces, break off and start again, to roam, or errer, as they say in French, along a smooth surface like a rhizome across the full range of his poetry and prose. And I'm at the stage now where I have put together a 5-act play, or it's better to say 5-act assemblage of raw material. And I've started working with a playwright who's a student in the dramaturgy department at the University of Glasgow. But we are also looking for directors, actors, performers, dancers, musicians, anyone who would be interested in engaging with hitherto unpublished material in English and collaborating in giving new happenings or new shapes or new becomings to Dieb's work in this culture. Thank you.